Thank you, John. I'm delighted that you bought a copy of the book. And I'm honored to be asked to speak at the annual meeting of Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. It's a great pleasure to pay a visit to your academy. Pour moi, c'est un grand plaisir de participer dans votre réunion annuelle. Je vais parler en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions ou des commentaires en français, je serai heureux de répondre. Learned societies, a real value or a pastime for aging academics? Well, to address the topic of the symposium, I'd like first to take a step backwards in time, quite a long way backwards in time, 3 centuries back in time, to the visit that Lemuel Gulliver paid to the Grand Academy of Lagoda in his voyage to the flying island of Laputa. He starts out his description as follows. This academy is not an entire single building, but a continuation of several houses on both sides of a street, which growing waste was purchased and applied to that use. I was received very kindly by the warden and went there for many days to the academy. Every room in it has 1 or more projectors, and I believe that there could not be fewer than 500 rooms in all. The first man I saw was of a meagre aspect with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged and singed in several places. His clothes, shirt and skin were all of the same color. He had been 8 years on a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers, which were put in phials, hermetically sealed, and let out to warm the air in raw, inclement summer days. He told me he did not doubt that in 8 years more he should be able to supply the Governor General's garden with sunshine at a reasonable rate, but he complained that his stock was low and entreated me to give him something as an encouragement to ingenuity, especially since this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. I made him a small present. My Lord had furnished me with money on purpose because he knew their practice of begging from all who went to see them. Well, the projectors that Swift described are, of course, researchers. Well, the habit of begging for money should have told you that to begin with. And I think there are 2 remarkable features of his account. The first is that research is represented as a ridiculous enterprise, and indeed in subsequent visits as a disgusting enterprise, requiring not merely stupidity, but something close to insanity. And this reads very strangely to a modern ear. But the second, more generally, is that research is being conducted, as a matter of course, at an academy. And that's quite accurate. There was a great radiation of academies between the middle of the 17th century and the middle of the 19th century, and their main purpose was to conduct, to promote, and to disseminate research. They were mostly private organizations, supported by their membership, although some were chartered and to varying extents supported by the state. The first of these were national institutions. So in the 17th century, we had the Royal Society of London founded in 1662, followed very soon by the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris in 1666, then the Academy in Berlin, and so forth. So around the start of the 18th century, there was the Russian Academy of Science, the Royal Swedish Academy soon afterwards. North America, of course, lagged a little behind for understandable reasons. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in Boston in 1780. The National Academy of Sciences of the USA was founded in 1863 by Act of Congress. And the Royal Society of Canada was founded by Act of Parliament a little later in 1882. At the same time, regional and local societies were springing up all over Europe. They were founded in Bologna, in Montpellier, in every considerable town and city throughout Europe, followed at the beginning of the 18th, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century by Dublin, Edinburgh, and so forth. At the same time, there was also a development of unchartered societies, like the Lunar Society in Birmingham, which met every month at the full moon. So there's an immense efflorescence of academies of different sorts at that time. So Swift was mocking the academy at the very period when academies were in their full flower, when they were being established throughout Europe as the principal foci of scientific research. And they continued to serve that role until the invention of the research university in Germany in the 19th century, and the slow spread of that institution to outlying and relatively backward areas like England, particularly Oxford and Cambridge. And Swift was mocking the academy because its research was directed towards abstract and speculative notions, was divorced from practical affairs, and therefore could be left safely to private individuals. As time went on, however, some very practical people became involved in the enterprise. For example, the Lunar Society of Birmingham included James Watt, Matthew Boulton, Josiah Wedgwood, Joseph Priestley, very hard-nosed individuals indeed. The Industrial Revolution had created the conditions in which advances in understanding physical processes could be linked to utility. And once that became clear, as it did towards around the beginning of the 19th century, there ensued a struggle between the academy and the state for the ownership of the means of the production of intellectual property. The academy lost, of course. There are many reasons for this, but two of them I think stand out. The first is the funding by the state of research in government institutions and eventually in university departments. And also the proliferation of specialized scientific and other societies that assumed within each field many of the functions that had previously been exercised by the academy. So the academy then altered, it changed, it lost its prominence in many cases. And there were, at the end of this process, I think there have been two main kinds of outcome. First of these is the operation of the academy as an agency of the state. When this happens, the academy can grow to enormous size and can direct the whole course of science in a particular country. This was often the case in authoritarian regimes, such as the USSR and China, which still have very large and powerful academies. The Russian Academy, for example, until recently, had something like 200,000 employees and directed dozens of research institutions throughout the country. We're not sure what's happening in Russia at the moment. The academy is being reformed under the beneficent direction of President Putin, but we can't get reliable information out yet. This was also true in the successor states. So the Slovak Academy still has several thousand employees. I was in Havana for the 150th anniversary of the Cuban Academy of Science, which retains enormous influence and authority within the Cuban state by virtue of its position as an agent of government. In fact, for the 150th anniversary, I was there with our Foreign Secretary, Jeremy McNeil, and in honor of the occasion, the Academy had founded a prestigious award to be given not annually, but only every 4 or 5 years to a Cuban scientist who was distinguished internationally and who had achieved groundbreaking breakthroughs in science. And the first recipient of this was the best-known Cuban scientist in the world, renowned throughout the world in scientific circles, Fidel Castro. Jeremy and I looked at one another and tried to imagine that in a Canadian context, but failed. So in such cases, power and influence has indeed been obtained, but at the price of a loss of independence. The second sort of outcome was the replacement of the academy by another organ of state, such as the National Research Council in Canada and similar institutions in other countries throughout the world. And in those cases, the Academy survives with full independence, but with a truncated mandate and with restricted means. And this has generally been the case in democracies, although there is very great variation between countries in which the Academy has remained rich and influential, such as the United States, UK, and recently Germany, and those in which it has become poor and neglected, such as Italy and Canada. It's a question to what is the level of support of the National Academy which guarantees the level of performance that we would expect from the National Academy of Sciences in the US or the Royal Society in the UK. As a very rough rule of thumb, to enable you to put this in a potential Canadian context, it's about $1 a head. About $1 per citizen per year in funding. Now, that's not an entirely meaningful figure because much of that is flow-through funding of one sort or another. But nevertheless, if you think in terms of $1 a head a year, that's the level which guarantees a satisfactory National Academy. Well, you might very well ask, and indeed the topic of this symposium directly asks, whether or not the Academy has any vital role to play in modern life now that its primary functions have been largely usurped by other kinds of organization. It retains an honorific role, of course, and the maintenance of a catalogue of leading scholars in a country is in itself a praiseworthy and mildly useful function. But it can also, of course, be a trap, as the title of the symposium indicates. The problem of aging membership, the fact that membership in academies is normally for life, longevity is increasing, and the membership therefore inevitably ages, and this process can only be reversed by radical measures. I remember the Royal Society of Canada once being referred to as a range of extinct volcanoes. But I was able to correct the speaker. That term was originally applied not to the Royal Society, but to the Senate. So does the Academy any longer have an active role to play in public life, in scientific life, in scholastic life? Well, I can think of two possibilities. There are others, but two stand out. The first, I think, is what has already been referred to provide advice that cannot be given by any other kind of organization. And the second is to represent the national scholarly community at international gatherings. So let's look first at advice. To be useful, advice has to be both authoritative and independent. It's obvious enough why it should have to be authoritative, but it's at least equally important that it should be independent. Advice that comes from a subservient entity is inevitably tainted by the hope of reward or the fear of reprisal. Advice given to governments is therefore credible only if it is given by organizations that are manifestly independent of government. Governments are usually reluctant to take the risk of inviting advice that may be unpalatable, however, may shun it, and in any event are unlikely to make expensive provision for obtaining it. So that presents the fundamental dilemma of academies. Academies that are generously funded by government lack independence or may be perceived to lack independence. Those without government funding are likely to lack capacity. And Paul Armstrong has already referred to the Canadian model, which is how we have attempted to address this situation, the formation of the Canadian Council of Academies. I'm glad to see its CEO, Janet Bax, in the audience today. The access to authoritative and independent scientific advice is always an important element of governance in any country. It's particularly important, perhaps, in the context of the forthcoming federal election. The duties of a citizen in a democracy are not restricted to ticking a box, although some politicians appear to think that they should be. They also involve participation in a wide range of social organizations and institutions whose function is, in part, to provide the checks and balances that prevent any particular political party from abrogating all the power of the state to itself. There are many such institutions. They are familiar. They include the judiciary, they include the press, and they also include the academy. As Niall Ferguson has recently reminded us in his book, The Great Degeneration, the decay of these institutions is both a symptom and a cause of the general decay of the state that he perceives as being the most serious threat to our current way of life. As a matter of fact, the Academy is not likely to be consulted systematically, either before or after the election, regardless of its outcome. Our political system, for better or worse, is not configured in this way. What we can do is to argue that regardless of its nature, the government absolutely needs a source of independent scientific advice, a source of routine, everyday scientific advice, not confined to expensive and time-consuming expert panel reports. And Royal Society has argued in a recent position paper that this should be provided, this advice should be provided by the appointment of a chief scientific officer who reports either to Cabinet or to Parliament, depending on the model you prefer. So if we cannot ourselves give advice, at any rate we can give advice about how advice should be given. The Academy plays a part outside as well as inside the nation by representing Canada in the international meetings of academies around the world. And the international role of academies has perhaps changed less than their national role. In principle, the national academies of different countries can maintain cordial relations even when their governments are at loggerheads or even at war. There was a certain amount of correspondence between the British and the French academies, even during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon himself, of course, encouraged the practice of the English technique of inoculation at that time. The only sensible thing he ever did. In practice, scientists are nowadays treated like any other travelers, except perhaps more so. When last year's G8 summit, which was to be held in Moscow, was cancelled because of the invasion of the Crimea, it was suggested that the G8 academies should nevertheless have their customary preliminary meeting, but this never happened, in part because of government pressure. There is nevertheless a feeling that in less exciting times, regular contact among the academies helps to maintain a uniform adherence to core academic values. As an example, I give the Inter-American Network of Academies of Science, which is the organization that brings together the national academies of all the countries in the hemisphere, from North, Central, and South America. And in doing so, I think encourages and promotes academic activities in countries where these are weak or lacking. There are still some countries, such as Paraguay, that actually lack national academies, but we can invite representatives and encourage the formation of academies in those countries. So there is, I think, a certain leveling upward that these international meetings can achieve. These international meetings of academies also serve to develop statements and advice to be distributed to government. Whether or not the government take heed of this advice is uncertain, but the stronger academies tend to embolden the weaker, which may gain some credibility from their association with their more illustrious or more powerful companions. Indeed, I think that we're sometimes held in greater regard abroad than we are at home. Give the example of the G7 meetings, for example, which are taken extremely seriously by many of the G7 leaders. When the meeting was held in France, we were received by the then President, Nicolas Sarkozy, in the Élysée Palace. It was held most recently in Berlin, in Germany. We had two meetings, the first with the Chief of Staff of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, who briefed us on what was expected and the statements that we were preparing and how they should be delivered. And then at a subsequent meeting by Chancellor Merkel herself, who delivered an extraordinarily well-informed speech on on the conduct of on science policy in the G7 countries. So these countries take their academies extremely seriously. I offered to brief our Minister of Science, Ed Holder, on the statements that have been prepared and their reception and what Chancellor Merkel in particular was expecting from them, but unfortunately he has been too busy to receive that briefing so far. There are a variety of different value-added tasks that academies can perform as part of their international duties. We have just concluded a meeting with our sister academy in Scotland, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, for example, basically on federalism, on what are the politics and economics of federal states. What are the implications of secession from federal states? Of course, this is a very timely issue in Scotland, where the independence referendum was held only 3 months ago. It's always a timely issue in Canada, of course. So I'm told that the meeting excited a lot of interest in Scotland, and I expect that the publications that are coming from it should attract some interest in Canada too. Next year, we'll be holding a joint meeting with the Royal Society of London as part of the Frontiers of Science programme. This is designed to attract scholars from a very wide variety of backgrounds, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences, with the idea that everyone attends all the meetings, that everyone is exposed to points of view and to disciplines which are unfamiliar to them, and that unexpected collaborations can arise as a result. This program has been very successful in the past, and we expect it to be equally successful when it's held in March next year in Whistler, BC. So these are the sort of value-added types of activities in which academies can engage at an international scale, and which I think are probably outside the scope of other kinds of institution. Well, I suspect, rather like I felt that Paul Armstrong and I are both preaching to the converted, this audience perhaps does not need to be persuaded of the values of the Academy. I'm not sure that Swift will be persuaded. I think he would likely to be just as scathing about the current activities of the Academy as he was about the activities of our predecessors in 1726. Well, he was wrong then, and I think he'd be wrong now. I think that we are still doing something of genuine value for the public good. But it may be worth emphasizing that our several academies are more likely to be effective when we act in unison than if we differ. It is only when we present a united front on important issues that we are likely to be strongly influential in the public life of Canada. I thank you again for your invitation, and I look forward to heightened collaboration in the future between the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and the Royal Society of Canada. Thank you.